are there tiers?
Yes, I tried my best to do tiers.
I know you like to do that, and I will still make you put the order, make there be an order in each tier. But I'm curious where you go with your tiers.
No, they're ordered, and I will say this about my tiers. My tiers are not necessarily representative of what tiers in this sense usually are representative of. They are representative for me of like, this is when I knew I needed to stop and think about who the next person was. I know that probably doesn't make any sense, but I think it will make sense once I get started. So for instance, when I did this, there was, I knew who number one was. I didn't have to think very hard about that. It's Nikola Jokic. I knew who number two was, and I didn't have to think very hard about that. And that was Giannis Antetokounmpo. And I knew there was a third player that I did not need to think very hard about. And that's why my first tier, you could have each of these three players in their own tier, as far as I'm concerned, because I think there was enough separation at this point between Jokic and Giannis, and then Giannis and the guy I'm going to say at number three, that they each deserve their own tier. And the third guy is Luka. And
I wrote down the wrong name.
Did you write down Steph?
No, I wrote down Embiid, the MVP of the league.
Embiid's coming. But again, this is where I have to go into, for one, Embiid doesn't play like the majority of regular season games. He gets injured sometimes. He also, because of reasons, maybe having to do with conditioning, maybe not, maybe having to do with his body type, I don't know. We now have a consistent track record, what seems to be, of him wearing down by the playoffs. And yes, he's the MVP of the league. I don't know if he deserved that MVP award last year, even though I said I'd give it to him because I think it was his time. In short, without getting into everything. But and I do think it should be a bit of a higher bar for winning your third straight. And I didn't think Jokic did enough to be awarded a third straight MVP, even if he was on paper better than Embiid last year. Luka, what he does on offense in comparison to literally everybody else in the league in terms of shot difficulty, self-creation of shots, how much he makes life easier for quite literally everybody else around him. He's an offense unto himself, more so than anyone really aside from Jokic, and I guess you'd say Steph. And I think the fact that, to me, Luka being 3 and not lower is my way of saying I'm not going to hold the fact that the Dallas Mavericks are dumpster fire of an organization against Luka Doncic. So that's why I have Luka number 3. And but that was essentially, those were the 3 guys that I thought of. And then I was like, okay, now I actually have to think about who's next.
So it doesn't shock me at all that, like his namesake, Luka Doncic, he goes third in this order because Michael Jordan went third in his draft. So you obviously have made the connection between the two players. What am I going to say? Luka's awesome. He has most efficient year if you go by effective field goal percentage. This most recent season. I think it's fascinating that you mentioned playoff success, which he does have the run to the conference finals last year, but they missed the play-in completely this past season.
But again,
so you're exonerating him, is what you're saying. I'm
exonerating him for last season.
Yeah. And Embiid won the MVP and made the second round. It's fascinating that that's the calculation you're making.
Yeah, because what happened last season and the mismanagement of the Dallas Mavericks, letting Jalen Brunson walk for nothing, that shouldn't be held against Luka Doncic. Completely bungling both KP trades, frankly, shouldn't be held against Luka Doncic. They have mismanaged this thing every step of the way. And now they're trying to, with the Kyrie Irving, with that reclamation project, we'll see if that works. We'll see if that works.
I guess I'm curious. We grew up with guys that we talked about their situations and we said, you can't blame them for only making the first round, and only being a 7 seed every year. Kevin Garnett's a perfect example where his ceiling, or I guess his floor, because
was not
of how
making the
good
playoffs.
No, he was making the playoffs. Like he was So let me
in
finish.
Minnesota, he didn't make it a few years.
So the first 7 years of his career, he was a first round exit. Then they had that year where they traded for Sprewell and Sam Cassell.
Yep.
And that starting five where they were a 1 seed and he won MVP. Then the next 3 seasons is when we started seeing him miss the playoffs, because they missed the playoffs his last 3 years. Then he goes to Boston. They're a title contender every year. And with Luka, I'm wondering if we're going to see that similar type of path where there's 1 year of playoff success, and then because of how mismanaged his career is, you have to see him go to another more competent organization to actually see. I'm curious if that's the pass we should be giving him, if that's the example, or if the fact that he's not really that impactful a defensive player is this, like, the floor for him is the 11th seed in a conference and not the 8th seed in a conference.
I think he's at least as impactful of a defensive player, whatever you want to take that word to mean, as the guy who's 4th on my list, Steph Curry. And Steph Curry is arguably a top 10 player of all time. And it's, if you think about the last 15 years of the NBA, 10, 15 years of the NBA, for him, or for me at least, it's LeBron, and then it's Steph and KD. And like, those are the guys that I think of. So, and Steph, it took him years to become Steph. I mean, he always had the traits, but like, to become what we know Steph as, Luka did it from the opening tip. So, I still think his ceiling as a career is higher than Steph's, and higher than just about anyone. I do have Steph 4th. I have him in a tier of his own because, again, after I thought of my top 3, I was like, okay, now I need to think about it. And like, Steph was the only guy out of everybody else I was like, yep, I have 0 issues here. Like, I know what he is. I know what he isn't. He's still awesome. Showed that in the playoffs. What's funny is I've been racking my brain to go through the top 25 and the top 50 and top 75. It's interesting where like my initial thought of having him 4th was only solidified by where I think some of the other players on the Warriors deserve to be now. And yet, like, we still take the Warriors seriously as a title contender. Why? Because of this dude. Mm-hmm. And part of me is like, is it too low to have him 4th? But that'll just get to the larger theme of this entire list, which is the league is in a really good place. And the fact that I do have the league MVP starting off the next tier 5th, like, he just won the MVP and he's 5th on this list. That shows me that the league is in a really good place. But yeah, this is a big tier. This next tier that's coming.
This next tier. So from 5 until the end of this tier.
It goes from 5 to 13, and it is basically anybody who I felt you could catch on the right night and come away saying, well, my goodness, that guy might be the best player in the NBA. If you could say that about a player, for me, they went in this tier.